Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar on Wednesday Wellness here for BBB serving the Pacific Southwest. And we are hosting daily webinars each week with different themes and topics to support our businesses in our community. So I hope you join us daily. So today we have a great speaker. We have Amber Pechin. She's a co-founder and nerd at Amplitude Media. She builds brands, websites, and big ideas. Her specialty is crafting compelling brand stories about complicated topics for clients in highly technical, scientific, or academic industries. Today, she's going to talk about the pandemic at the disco, finding that focus during a chaotic and uncertain future. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Amber.
All right. So, hello. I'm really glad everybody made it here today. I hope that your family is healthy and weathering this weird, uncertain time in a safe and collective manner that's working for everybody. I am presenting Pandemic at the Disco, Finding Focus During a Chaotic and Uncertain Time. And it's one of the things I started thinking about a couple weeks ago and wrote a blog post about that I'll share, and which is why I was reached out to ask to talk about this today. So I was seeing a lot of different business owners here in the community who were trying to carry on as if nothing had happened, and expecting the same levels or even higher levels of productivity from themselves and their teams. And because they had all this extra time all of a sudden. And I found both of those things to be unrealistic and not fair expectations to have of ourselves or others. And so I was exploring how to find focus when everything has changed and the future is uncertain. And one of the things I do to cope with uncertainty and trauma is to use information, but also humor. So hopefully that carries through this. But first, I want to take a minute, if we can all just take a minute and have a deep breath and virtually hug each other. So thanks for being here. Thanks for joining in, and give yourself a little hug for making it to Wednesday, which feels like it's been the longest month ever. And typically when I give presentations, this is a little secret I have, I give, this slide is in every single presentation I give, because these three outcomes are the same three outcomes I always want to have from every presentation I give. And I was looking at today and I thought, today we're gonna have a different goal and different outcomes that we're looking for. There we go. So we're going to, through this conversation, talk about how to communicate with empathy, how to connect with compassion, and how to find focus. All of these things as we find ourselves in new physical environments, but also through the mental and emotional fog you may be feeling over the last couple of weeks. But I think we can still have fun, and I think it's possible to do these things while also enjoying ourselves. So this is why you should care what I have to say or not. I co-own Amplitude Media with my business partner, Reed, where we build brands, websites, and big ideas. And we like to take ideas and make them bigger and a lot more fun. So we do a lot of creative consulting and business development. And I'm also, as Winston mentioned earlier, a super nerd. And if you can give me a super nerdy, boring, dry topic, my favorite thing to do is make it interesting and find a fun way to tell a story. But even more important than that, those things for this conversation, is why I have any right to be talking to you today other than being a business person. I'm also a real life human. So this isn't a picture of me. This is a picture of Susan. She is the head of HR at my company. And since we're focusing on the human side of business versus the business side of being human, I got Susan's advice and she recommended that humaning is always a better idea than not. But I'm also a business owner who's worked from home for quite a few years now. And now I have 4 mostly teenagers at home who are also trying to homeschool at the same time. And I know I'm not alone in this situation. I also am a writer and a storyteller, and actually have worked for a few years here in Phoenix as a a stand-up comedian and improv player, and doing live storytelling on stage. I love giving presentations like this. Well, not like this, but presentations in general, because I love crowds and I love the energy in a room. So today is a little differently because I'm sitting in the corner of my bedroom / office talking to a screen by myself, even though I know there's at least a few of you out there paying attention and listening. And I'm going to tell jokes, and like the secret dad joke teller I am deep inside of me, I'm going to laugh at them anyway, and I'm going to pretend like you're laughing with me. So feel free to join in or not, and we'll laugh along together. But I love humans. I love connecting with humans. My favorite joke is that I love humans. They're delicious. And I think it's funny every time I tell it. My kids have started rolling their eyes. But typically the way I love to connect with humans is through physical interaction and showing up face to face, and I love to feed people. So I typically have pancake parties at my house, and I love to invite all kinds of people from random corners of my life to come. And that, I think, is one of the most disappointing parts about social distancing for me, is that pancakes are put off indefinitely for the time being. And virtual pancakes just don't seem to be the same thing. So those are my qualifications, even though my HR rep is not here in the room with me currently. But we're going to start today by talking about how to communicate with empathy. And I want to start by saying that I am not a mental health professional. I am a communication professional, and sometimes I play a communication expert on TV or the internet. But I'm also a human who has experienced a few traumas in my life. And although this is my very first pandemic, it isn't my first time at the trauma rodeo. And a lot of people are going to be experiencing trauma for the first time in their lives during the course of the next couple of months / year. And communicating through trauma, and in personal situations, but also in professional situations, are skills we're all going to have to acquire. And so today we're largely going to talk about communication through these unsettling and traumatic events. But even though most of you, I'm assuming, are also not not mental health professionals, we can all learn how to communicate better and be more human in our communication, which helps with behavioral health and helps with mental health of all of our employees, our families, and also our clients as we do client work. So I am also a fan of Brené Brown, and think that we can all learn a lot more from paying attention to her. But as we have this conversation, I want you to think through the lens of how the things we're talking about apply to you individually, as a just individual human, but then also as a leader of a team, or a leader of a family, also a leader in your community and neighborhood. And so one of the ways we earn trust is through communication and paying attention and giving those gestures of genuine care and connection. And those are the things that we really need to be emphasizing as leaders. And also a major point that is usually one of the things that I try to remember myself, but also remind other people, is that communication is more about listening with intent than it is about talking. So one of my favorite sayings is, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and you should use them in proportion. So you should listen twice as much as you talk. But to get real for a minute, we're gonna first start with acknowledging that it's okay not to be okay. And acknowledging that not very many people in the entire world are very okay right now. Me personally, it's been a really rough couple of weeks. It's hard to remain focused. It's hard to see through the fog. It's hard to get the things done that I know I need to get done. And I'm seeing it not just in myself, but I'm seeing it in my clients. I'm seeing it in my coworkers. I'm seeing it in my kids. I'm seeing it everywhere. And when we can acknowledge that and make space for that ability to be vulnerable, it's a lot easier for people to be vulnerable in return. But also when we can have that radical acceptance for the people on our teams and the people in our families and the people that we're doing business with, and we can just accept the fact that they're doing the best they can and give them that space to do so, we'll all be a lot better off in the end, and build not only more empathetic societies, but also more empathetic teams. So if your team started in an office and then over the last few weeks has moved from working in a location altogether to working from home or other locations, we have to accept the fact that everything is not fine. The transition from working in a business environment to all of a sudden working in a makeshift space at your home is going to be different. And it might be a positive location or positive change, or a comfortable change for a lot of people. Even under the best of circumstances, when you've made the choice and there isn't a global pandemic happening, the transition from working in an office to working from home takes a lot of shifting of mindset, shifting of emotional regulation, shifting of focus. And in the time that we're experiencing now, people are shifting and dealing with the major upheaval and the climate of uncertainty, but they're also trying to effectively figure out how to do their job while typically caring for either children or elderly parents full-time while also working, or they're dealing with instability of the world, anxiety with themselves and anxiety in their family. There may be safety factors that they're also encountering. Not everybody's homes are safe places to be. But so if you expect people to just carry on as usual, just from their kitchen table or couch, you're gonna hit some real road bumps and some disappointments. And the change in shifts as well as the change in household structure are things that we need to learn to accommodate as business owners and as employees and as humans in general. And so we might need to shift some of how we do business. And currently we're all, well, and I don't know, there are people who are sick already, but we're all worried about potentially becoming ill in the near future, or somebody in our family. And eventually somebody is going to be dealing with those things in your circle, just based on how this virus is spreading. And so making a plan to figure out how your team's going to work through illness, either of themselves or people in their family, is also a thing that we need to make sure that we're preparing for. And it's a mental and emotional preparation as much as it is making the plans for how business is going to get done. And then also keeping in mind that there are differences in how to work and relate in general in the world. And so the extroverts on your team might be really, really struggling, especially if they're an extrovert who lives at home or lives alone. Sorry, everybody lives in a home of some sort, hopefully. Anyway, while the introverts in your life also might be struggling because I know at my house, there's 6 of us, and the extroverts among us are actually doing quite well because we have people to entertain us all day long, while the introverts are struggling because they have us extroverts around them all day long. So keep those things in mind for your team as well. And then we want to think about the grief and the trauma of the situation. Everyone reacts to stress, anxiety, and trauma differently. When we're all also in a space where we are dealing with grief, and that grief comes in a lot of different forms and a lot of different reactions that might feel expressed in a way that doesn't feel like it kind of jives with the situation. Specifically when you're having a conversation and somebody overreacts completely to something that was said in a way that wasn't anticipated, in a way that they wouldn't normally do so. This is a reaction of trauma and of grief. And the grief can be, the grief is the loss of not just actual death and grief in that form, although we're going to be dealing with that as well, but grief of the loss of what they thought things were going to be like. So that loss of normalcy, the loss of stability, the anxiety of what's going to happen in the job market, means anxiety of what's going to happen in their family, the grief of the world being the safe place that they thought it was. And the way people react to grief is they can sometimes feel like polar opposites. Some people react by having zero focus and remaining unable to focus on the situation in general and get nothing done, and they walk around in kind of a fog. Some people deal with grief and trauma by hyper-focusing. And so you may see some members of your team who are getting so much done that you didn't even think was possible, but it's because they're using work and essentially overworking themselves as a way of coping and not dealing with the situation, potentially. But you also might deal with people whose productivity goes way down. And I think having conversations about that, which we'll discuss in just a minute, but also acknowledging and being aware of the different reactions that people may have to the situation as being different and valid is a great place to start. And I'll have some resources on reading about grief and trauma and reading about empathy and communication as well that I'll have available. But making sure that you are aware of all of these different reactions as you deal with your team and deal with clients and deal with the public at large and your family is a great place to start. And then also, the emotional intelligence is something we talk about a lot in business as this vague, it's important to have thing, or have been the last few years. It's going to be more and more important as the next few months unfold to acknowledge that the emotional intelligence is what's going to help your team survive and thrive in this chaotic time. One of my favorite things to phrases that I come back to a lot is emotions aren't logical or linear, so they'll come back around at the worst time possible. And this happens through both trauma and grief, post-traumatic stress, things like that. And so when someone on your team, you might feel like you've dealt with some crazy event in your team, and it will be months later and somebody will finally, it'll click in and they'll react to it. And they might not even realize that's what's happening. So when someone on your team or you aren't acting in a way that feels like it's quote unquote normal, make sure you're giving them the space and grace to acknowledge that these aren't normal times, and having that emotional intelligence to view things as what the real issue is versus the current issue that looks like it on the face. It's kind of like that thing I think we've all experienced in our families at one point or another, or in a relationship at one point or another, where there's that one trigger conversation that is never about that conversation. It means that something else is really, really wrong. The closer you work with your team, the more you'll start to notice those things, and the better you can acknowledge them and de-escalate the emotional portion of the conversation, the better we'll all be in the long run. However, as a human, and I keep saying that, I'm assuming you're all humans. I don't know, maybe some of you are droids or aliens. I have no idea really, but is we have to take care of ourselves first. So if you aren't healthy, then you can't help take care of the people around you and make sure that they're healthy. And so put on your own mask first. Like they say when you're on an airplane, you always put the mask on yourself first, not the child. And so make sure that you are taking care of yourself by prioritizing your own mental health. Your team is going to take your lead. So demonstrate mental health by creating the boundaries that you need to make sure you are staying healthy, even though you're working from home all the time. Make sure if you have lower productivity, or if your expectations are to, your productivity expectations have changed based on the situation, based on the arrangement, just make sure you're communicating and seeking help when you're not doing okay. And that can be help by talking to your team, or it can be help by seeking mental health help from an expert. But then telling your team about it and talking to them about it is a great place to start, to make sure that everybody knows that they also have permission to prioritize their mental health. So create space to discuss the worries that your team has and how they can approach them with a daily emotional health check-ins, and then empathize with them and normalize the feelings that everybody's having. And this is where you'll get the most bang for your buck, essentially, is when you can be vulnerable about who you are and how you're feeling, your own emotional state. Then you're going to help your team respond in kind, and normalize that vulnerability in your workspace. Now, the thing here that I'd like to talk about too is making sure that you don't feel like you have to be the rock solid person who has it all together just because you're the leader of the team. And actually, the best leaders are the ones that will model the behavior that you're expecting from your teammates. And there is, but Brene Brown has a book called Dare to Lead that's fantastic, but then she has a free workbook that's free you can download from her website for people to follow along with, work through on your team. And that creates some of that space for normalizing the emotions, and it creates some of that space for making sure that your team can communicate effectively through the trauma that we're going to be experiencing. And then, just as a note, when we are communicating with empathy, it's really easy sometimes to confuse empathy and sympathy. And I'll send out a video link that explains it really well. But empathy is the capacity to understand what somebody's feeling, and to relate to their feelings because you can feel them inside of yourselves. And now, this is a unique situation in our current world situation, is that we are all going through the same experience in one form or another. However, we're all going to experience it differently and live it differently. And while the main example of what's going on, the main crisis that's happening might be the same crisis that we're all going through, it is actually going to be different for every person. Every different person is going to experience it differently, and it's going to impact them differently. And that is going to be a really, really important thing to recognize and acknowledge, so that we aren't we're not coming into a situation and saying, oh, I know exactly how you feel. And that is going to be a key thing to remember as we go through the next few weeks and months, is to not feel sorry for somebody for what's happening to them in their situation, but to instead feel with them instead of for them. So how can we walk in their shoes? How can we help connect, essentially? And that is our next section, which is connect with compassion. So as much as we're empathetic, we also want to be compassionate. And make sure that even though we are disconnected, that we are actually connecting when we communicate and when we talk. One of the ways that we do this at Amplitude Media is we have emotional check-ins. This is something we do it through Slack, and we use different tools. Currently, what we do is called the Magic Minute. But the reason why we do it is so that we make sure that we're not only on the same page when it comes to work that needs to be done, clients that need to be communicated with, but we're also on the same page when it comes to how we're feeling that day. We work in a very close team, and we work on projects that waver in intensity. But as partners, if one of us is feeling really super stressed out, or feeling like nothing's going to work, that ability to check in emotionally and say, you know, I'm really struggling today. I didn't sleep well last night. I'm worried about, I'm worried about this situation or something else. The ability to ask, to go deeper, is really what helps us as a company keep moving and connecting. And so we're really close because we work together very closely and we're really good friends. But emotionally checking in with people who you have a different relationship with, as clients or as coworkers, or even as members of your family, emotionally checking in digs deeper than just saying, "Are you okay?" Our standard response tends to be fine, and it's time that we dig deeper than that. So when somebody says, "How are you?" when you ask somebody how you are and they say fine, ask more questions. Ask why. And so you can get down to the real heart of the story. And one of the key things to remember here is that communication and vulnerability is reciprocal. You have to be willing to give a little bit if you want to get a little bit. So to connect as humans is good business, but it's also just good humanity. So offer a little bit of yourself first, and if you want to get anything in return. And I have a couple examples of this. There we go. Of how you can ask more specific questions rather than "How are you doing today?" You might want to say, "How are you feeling today?" That's a really good place to start. It's a slight switch of the conversation, but it's enough difference that you're asking specifically for that emotional answer. And you can even say, like, focus for me is an emotional thing. When I'm emotionally well, my focus is emotionally well as well. Asking your team how they're focusing on different situations and things in life is a really great place to start. But also, keeping in mind that my human resources director at my company is a dog. I believe that when you work with humans as a human, you should be okay with being human together. Your mileage may vary, and your human resources director might disagree with me, but I think it's okay to ask about people's families and how they're doing. It's okay to ask about their kids or their spouse or their parents or their dog. And now that we're in this brave new world that we're in, we need to be doing that even more. And even asking if they're, especially if you have members of your team who live alone and don't have immediate family or friends nearby, checking in and making sure they're making other connections outside of work is a really great thing to be doing. Loneliness is a dangerous, dangerous thing. And when we're supposed to be so distant from each other, we need to make sure that we're still connecting. And you don't have to be so blunt to say, "Are you connecting with people virtually?" Instead, you can ask, you can ask how they're managing to stay connected with their friends through the distance. You can ask them if they've found. You can ask for their advice rather than asking directly about their life, and just say, "Hey, I'm looking for some new ways to connect with my family who lives in another state. Have you found a way to do that in a way that works really effectively for you virtually?" But then also checking in productivity wise is good as well. And works better when you communicate with the empathy and understanding that you're on the same team and you're looking to get hopefully the same results, versus you are checking up on somebody and seeing if you can micromanage or if you can get them in trouble for not getting the work done they're supposed to do. And so instead of saying, "What did you get done?" or "What are you working on?" in a way that feels more direct and more like it's something that can cause, I guess, the emotion of protection. So they're afraid, and so they're going to protect themselves and shut down. Instead saying, "Is there anything I can help you work through or that you're stuck on that you want to talk about?" Or if something is taking longer than usual, instead of just asking when it's going to be done, ask them, present it as a situation where you're acknowledging the situation first and then offering to help. So it seems like this is taking you longer than usual. Is there anything I can help you with? Anything you're stuck on? Can we shift the timeline? Can we shift the expectation? Can we take something else off of your plate, help you reprioritize? What are some different ways we can do those things? So it gives us a little bit better, more of a framework for what those conversations look like. Also, talking about how to talk is one of the things that we do a lot at our company. It's, even though we've worked together for almost 4 years, the communicating about how to communicate, when to communicate, where to communicate, what to communicate is still an ongoing project. I really like Basecamp's communication guidelines, and I'll share that link with you as well. But revamping what works and what the rules for your team are. The talk about how to talk is vital to success, especially when working remotely. We also use tools like Slack and Zoom and other resources, but I'm going to say that I feel like the tools are less important than the routine and the system that you built. And some things to keep in mind is that building in that flexibility to have the system work for your team is where the key to success is as well. Figuring out if you're going to check in every day. Are you going to check in at the beginning of the day? Are you all getting started at the same time? Or is there a time that works better in the afternoon when people are maybe less productive on focus work, but they're more productive in the ability to chat? Or if your team is working maybe different hours, make sure that you're communicating that as well. Communicating when people are working, when they can be contacted and when they can't be contacted. And as we navigate the landscape over the next few months, you might find that some of your team members have to share shifts of caring for kids or doing schoolwork with kids. You might find that some of your team members might have to shift caring for parents, or maybe they are working better later in the evening, earlier in the morning. So figure out what everybody's schedule is that works best for them, and when things line up, when they can expect to be contacted by you, when they can expect to be contacted by customers. And then most importantly of all of the things is to expect things to always keep changing. Those aren't the change is the only constant that we're going to have in this whole thing. So make sure that your team is talking about the talking, like I said before, and finding how to shift and be flexible and what works best for everybody. And then I feel like this changes screen slower than I want it to. Okay. Next we have permission to human. So we are, like I said, all humans who are working with humans, and the key in the next few weeks or months or whatever is to be even more human with each other if we can. So I really love when I get to see the other side of people's lives, and it might just be because I think it's hilarious, but like we're all just going to get a lot more awkward over the next few months, especially if we're not used to working from home, and we're not used to working through all of these different dynamics and things like that. And so I think we need to write each other permission slips, and know that weird things are going to happen, and that we're going to have off days, and we're going to need to take a day to recoup. As we have, especially if you work with teams that are cascading, like teams around the country or around the world, we're all going to have waves of effect from the virus that hit us at different times. And so you might be super productive one week because everything's fine and dandy, whereas your client or your coworker or your teammate who lives in a place that's harder hit might be really struggling because they're trying to pretend like everything is normal while they're also trying to cope with the sickness or death of friends or family or loved ones, or they're dealing with a different kind of restriction or shutdown than you currently are. And that was not the right slide. I'm actually going to stop the share and restart it really fast because I shifted something and I'm afraid it's not shifting. So speaking of awkward and not quite working the way you expect it to. Um, okay. Sorry, that was awful, but it would have been more awful if I hadn't done that. Just trust me on that. Oh, except now it's, speaking of winning. All right. Okay, so speaking of weirdness too, the interruption of dogs and kids and spouses and learning new technologies and interrupting technologies is something else we're going to have to be pretty patient with. I work remotely all the time, and so figured out the setup and what works most of the time. And I still have kids that walk in. I still have dogs that start barking. I still have apparently like neighborhoods of honking car horns for some reason. Acknowledging and rolling with those things, I think, is the best thing to do in general. And like just being willing to acknowledge the human side of things and the human side of people. And then we all win. So, and then last of all is talking about focus. I have ADD. I'm pretty open about that. I officially diagnosed from a doctor, all of the things. And so finding the ability to focus when I'm working from home and when I'm distracted by other things has been one of the things that it's a constant reiteration and retrying and iteration and reiteration. So I have some tools for that work that I found have worked for me. And part of it is building a ritual. So we maybe, most people have a ritual when they work not at home, and our brains and our bodies like that routine. So where you may have got used prior to currently, you may have gotten up in the morning and you get showered and dressed and eat breakfast and get coffee and drive to work and listen to your favorite, podcast or music station, or talk to your mom on the phone as you drive. To make that transition into the workplace, you no longer have that anymore. And so it's figuring out how to put your brain and body into work mode when you work from home, and then how to get your team into work mode when it comes to creativity and connecting when you're working virtually. I know I work best typically in the early morning when I don't have distractions. And so I have an early morning ritual when I do my best writing. And as I say all of this too, I'm going to tell you that my rituals and my schedules have been completely out of whack for like 3.5 weeks now. So acknowledge that times are weird, and building a ritual is something you can come back to and keep working on and always tweak and iterate. But when I'm on my best behavior, I'm up at 5 in the morning and I get up and I do my best writing in the first two hours of the morning before anyone else in the house is awake and when nobody's expecting anything from me. But you might need to work out first thing in the morning. You might need to shower and get dressed and put on work clothes. I prefer a work wardrobe that's a little bit more comfortable than I would wear to an office. But you can maybe you work best if you get up in the morning, make your bed, have breakfast, and walk the dog. Your ritual is going to be different than your work ritual used to be, and it's okay to find a new normal. But that ritual to get yourself into work mode, as important as that is, it's also important to have a ritual to get yourself out of work mode. That's one of the main things that's hardest to do when you work from home, is turning yourself off and turning off work. And that's something that a lot of people struggle with in general, but it's even worse when your office is in the corner of your bedroom or on your kitchen table. And so I find that I do best when I make an announcement, even if it's only to myself in my room, when I say I am done for the night, and I shut my laptop and I go do other things. You can, maybe that's when you do your workout. Maybe that's when you make dinner for your family. Maybe that's when you walk the dog. I assume everybody has a dog. I'm probably wrong there. But whatever your ritual is for powering down is just as important as your ritual for getting started. And then develop your systems for success. And for me, that's one of my big ones is what is the most important thing for me to get done? What is the system for getting that done? And so building the type of person you want to be helps you build a system to make all of the little choices during the day that helps you be that person easier. So I'm a writer, and if I'm going to be a writer, I have to write every day. So that's why I have built into my systems a system for getting writing done every day. I'm also for example, the best way I do that is when I program the coffee maker the night before, when I go to bed on time, when I plug my phone in the bathroom versus next to my bed, so I go to sleep reading a book rather than scrolling through Facebook or playing a dumb game on my phone. But there's also systems for putting yourself into deep focus mode, which is for me the hardest thing to do when I work from home, but it's actually easier than working in an office in my instances especially. And so when I'm in work mode and focus mode, my phone is not on my desk unless I'm expecting a client call. But I also use tools to limit my access to distracting websites and social media. And they turn all of those accesses off on my computer during work hours. I also make sure that I work in chunks, and I have those chunks that are specific and they're repeated over time. And then speaking of slides that didn't change, I didn't change that last point. But another way that I find focus is by having boundaries. And so those boundaries include I have a sign on my door. If my door is shut, my family's not supposed to interrupt me. I know when I'm supposed to be working and when those chunks happen and what the system is to make that happen. But then I have to have the boundaries with myself to make sure that I execute them. I don't talk to neighbors during the day. I don't have phone calls with my sisters during the day, even though I love them. When I'm working, and these are my work boundaries. And so that's really, really important to have. And then last is tools for your toolbox. And I'll send out these slides, as well as send out a list of all of the different tools that I use, and different links and books and podcasts that I've listened to, but also resources for mental health and making sure that you have mental health tools to deal with. So, but some of those tools are physical and some of those tools are mental and emotional. And so some of the most important ones you're going to find over the next few weeks and months are going to be tools for dealing with anxiety and stress. So tools like grounding, meditation, visualization exercises, but also making sure that you have tools in your toolbox that help you connect with your team, relate to your team, and also have the ability to tap into the emotional parts of our humanity, so we can connect and build stronger, more emotionally resilient teams through this time of stress. So I will send those out through to all the emails that signed up for the registration. And I also just want to say that we will get through this together. And I think that my optimistic Pollyanna part of me says that we'll emerge from this better as humans, not worse. And I really believe in that. And I really think that that's an important thing to talk about and to make sure that we're doing and connecting with. So, and I think now we'll do the Q&A. And also, if you have a question that you didn't think of or you want to connect, we can absolutely connect afterwards and have a conversation or text or email or whatever. So.
Yeah, so we have a couple of questions that were submitted through the chat. So our first one comes through and they write, how does your advice change for owners that are losing money and may have to let some people go?
That is a really good question. And I think that there are, and I'm just going to be honest, I've never fired anybody before, except for, well, I fire my kids on a regular basis, but they keep coming back even though I stopped paying them. But I, I think that it's really, really important to communicate as honestly as you can. I'm going to start with that. And you can still communicate with empathy and compassion. And I think communicating the current situation, people know and they anticipate it, and making sure that you are doing everything you can to help them find something else is an important place to start too. And being transparent in where the company's at, because I think actually even more dangerous than the letting somebody go might be the anticipation of being let go and not knowing where the company's at. And I think that that transparency prior to letting somebody go gives people a place to start with, and gives people a place to know that it's coming, but or that it's not coming. And so communicating effectively and empathetically, but also being compassionate to the situation, I think is vital. And firing somebody via email, text, or phone call is not good form in general. And that's, I think, going to be the weirdest thing, is when you have to let somebody go, but you have to do it via phone call or video chat or something. But I think helping them find the tools and resources and being open about the situation and is going to be the best places to start. But always showing compassion is all, like, I just don't feel like you lose in that way.
Okay, so we have another question. Is it okay to get my team together for a wellness check virtually every week to check up on everyone's mentality? If so, how long should that take so it doesn't affect productivity?
So I think it's okay, and I think it's actually going to affect productivity positively, not negatively. I feel like, so we do emotional check-ins and productivity check-ins in theory every day. And I say in theory because we're not perfect at this. But I don't think it's wrong to do that. And one of the things that we've actually started doing more recently is we're working through the Brene Brown Dare to Lead workbook as a team. And we take an hour and a half or 2 hours every Friday and do that. It's a part of the week when we're slowest. It's a part of the week when we have things are winding down for the weekend versus ramping up for the week. So it feels like it's a better time to do that. And it gives the thing that's beneficial about it is it gives a structure to that emotional check-in and the mental health wellness aspect of it. Additionally, to keep in mind though, if you have a larger team, creating the team cohesiveness and vulnerability can be tricky. I think it makes it even more important, but make sure you have a structured framework to follow so that there is a definite beginning point and end point and goal of each conversation. And that might help you feel like it's more productive because there is that output. But I think not addressing mental health and not addressing the emotional wellness of your team is going to impact you negatively a lot more than spending an hour or an hour and a half every week talking about it will impact it by a loss in productivity time-wise. And another benefit of that is that it gives a space for your team to say, this is where they're struggling or having a hard time, and have those conversations, which also sometimes just having the conversation about what's going on impacts productivity positively as well.
Okay, so there's just a follow-up question from that.
Okay.
For the wellness check, should those be separate from the productivity check-in, or should they be at the same time?
I think it depends on your team. And that's going to be whatever works best for your team. So we literally, so it's called the Magic Minute. And it's something we do in Slack every day. So it's just like, it's a Slack check-in where it's like, here's my emotional check-in for the day. I'm feeling really good. I had a good night's sleep. I'm excited about the projects we're working on. I'm looking forward to whatever it is. Or that emotional check-in might be like, I'm really struggling today. I'm just having a lot of anxiety about the current world situation, or I'm worried because I feel like I kind of have a cough, or I'm worried about whatever. And then it frames the day and the expectation in both people's minds, and then, or your whole team's mind, or whatever the project is. But then and then it's the productivity check-in, where it's like, this is my goal for today. These are my top 3 things is typically what I like to do. I have my 3 main outcomes of today are these 3 things. And so but that works for us and our team, and that's not always how we've done it. Like, we've changed it, probably 1,000 times. And some days there might be more or less of one or the other. So I think it's how your team builds the expectation, and what works for your team, and also what your team feels comfortable with, because I think that's another key point, is that you can't you need to keep in mind everybody's different comfort levels. I'm really comfortable being pretty open and about who I am and what's going on in my life, but not everybody is. And it's really important to make sure that we are keeping everybody's comfortable level in check as well, not making them more uncomfortable. So that's a very vague answer, but what works best for your team and your team is most comfortable with is what's going to be the right answer there.
Great. So our next question is, how do you suggest communicating boundaries to people that feel it is therapeutic to talk about the outbreak, but is also damaging your well-being?
That is a really good question. And I think one of the things that is, so I've been hyper-focused. If you are my friend on Facebook, you have noticed this. I've been really hyper-focused on the outbreak and the news and the data that goes with it. And part of it is my way of coping is through information and then communication. Not everybody is as comfortable with that, and that needs to be a respected thing. And so if they're communicating with you, over communicating with you about it in a way that's making you anxious, I think the best way to deal with that is by saying it, which is hard, but it's like, but you can't, boundaries are your way of communicating how people get to treat you. And so if it's something you don't want to talk about, just, you can say, this makes me feel more anxious, and I understand that you're learning these things and you're excited, like or you're worried, or you're anxious, or whatever it is, but I can't talk about this every day. I can't do this and focus. So I need to limit these conversations, and can we talk about something else? And if they don't respect that boundary, reiterate and say, I'm not ready to talk about this right now. I need to talk about something else. Is going to be your best way to do that. Is that very direct boundary setting, but you can acknowledge at the same time their need to have that conversation, but they don't need to have it with you necessarily. And sometimes too, it's the underlying, it's getting to what the real question, the real problem is, as I like to say, and this is something I use with my teenagers, where if one of my teenagers is really upset about something and it feels completely irrational, usually it's a matter of checking in, actually, are you hungry? Are you tired? Are you scared? Those are the 3 that usually are the things at our house. When was the last time you ate? When was the last time you had a good nap? Or what time did you go to bed last night? And what else is bothering you? And so keeping in mind that somebody might be hyper-focused on the outbreak and the virus itself as a way of coping. And so looking for those underlying messages they're sending, that they're talking about when they're talking about it. Are you the boss and they're talking to you about accessibility because they're trying to gauge where you're at with it and how secure their job is? Is it your boss communicating with you for the same reason? They want to see how you're coping with it and how productive you're being. So it's like figuring out what that is. That might be, it's also just the hot, like it's pressing on everybody's mind, and a lot of people are stressed about it. But it's always appropriate to tell somebody when you are not comfortable talking about something. And it can also be, it's usually appropriate to acknowledge why they want to talk about it, thank them for wanting to share with you, tell them you can't do it right now, and then tell them when you can, or if you can, when you set those boundaries.
Great. So we actually have a participant who wants to ask their questions. So Melanie, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk so you can go ahead and ask your question.
Perfect.
So Melanie, if you want to just unmute yourself, I just allowed you so you can actually ask your question online.
Oh, okay, excellent. So thank you so much for a great presentation, Amber. I absolutely loved it.
Thanks.
Yeah, and so you were saying that you did a really good job, like asking your kids when, if they're scared and checking in with them with their food and their sleep and all that. How do you best recommend that when people do come to us that are feeling fearful, that we address it in a way that is also not not dishonest too?
What do you mean dishonest?
Like,
Not
it's a
real
scary
about.
time for all of us, and there's so much uncertainty. I can see this coming up in conversations that I anticipate having here, and I admire your communication skills. I've always admired them, and how do you do it?
So communicating like the reality of the situation while also acknowledging how scary it is.
Absolutely.
Okay. So for me at least, it's about assessing somebody's ability to absorb the information you need to share. So it's really easy to try and tell somebody everything you know all at once, or everything you're worried about, or all the things you see coming, but it's not effective. It shuts people down. And because one of our reactions to fear is, if we, like, from an evolutionary standpoint, we have our reptilian brain, and when we're afraid of something, then we run, or we fight it, or we freeze, and those are all things that people react to, in not even in a physical sense, but in a communication and emotional sense. And so somebody who's afraid might just freeze, and you think that they're like listening to everything you're saying, but they're not. They're just frozen and they're not absorbing it. Or they might flee. They might say, I can't have this conversation, and they disappear and they run. Or they might, and I've lost it. So flight, fright. So they might run away from it. They might freeze and ignore it, or they might just not acknowledge it at all. Like they might, I completely lost my train of thought. Freeze, flee.
Fight, flight, fright, freeze, flock, frolic. Yeah, all the F's. There are a lot of F's. Yeah.
The five F's of trauma communication. But it is like acknowledging what they can handle at the moment, and instead of saying like, here's 10,000 pages of information, instead be like, start the conversation by asking questions so you can gauge where they're at. And so, how are you feeling about this? What do you think about this information? What do you think is going to happen? And gauge what their current grasp of your perception of the reality of the situation is, because we can all be wrong sometimes. And so, starting from that perspective, so like when most of us are working through the 5 stages of grief as we're dealing with this too. We're all acknowledging that the grief of potential loss, the grief of the world we thought we were going to live in. And so people are working through the trauma portions of it and trying to protect their brains and protect themselves, but they're also working through like acknowledging this is real, making bargains so it's not real, getting really, really angry. And so part of it is saying, when their anger ramps up or their anxiety ramps up, whatever the emotion is, as it ramps up, they're no longer thinking logically and rationally. Instead, they're thinking from like an evolutionary reptile brain standpoint. And so it's like understanding those things too, and getting them to regulate the emotions and ramp down so they can hear you. And the best way to do that is by asking questions to get them to engage, because then they have to think and use their logical brain. And so with my kids, even, because they had to come to terms with the whole situation too. Like, you're probably not going back to school after spring break. Yeah, that trip we've been planning for 6 months, probably not going on that trip. Like, we're going to have to acknowledge that that's not happening. And so It's it's having that conversation where you talk about what the situation is and then talk about potential scenarios, but then also ask where they're at with it and start with a, well, it might be, and because none of us actually really know, first of all, but also like build different scenarios and work through it. Might be a better place to go, but then honor their fear at the same time. Don't push people to have conversations they're not ready for, because that's never productive.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for coming.